Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. You late stragglers, there's room up front, just like in high school. There's always seats in front. Thank you for coming to the New America Foundation. I am Michael Dannenberg, the Director of the Education Policy Program here at New America. Very pleased to have you all here. This event has been sponsored by the Foundation for Child Development as part of our work to expand and improve early education in America. And we are, as you know, the focus of this event is the context of the No Child Left Behind Act reauthorization, as well as the movement for universal pre-K in the states. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers and then turn it over to them quickly. I've encouraged them all to keep their remarks short so that we can have an engaging exchange, hopefully among them, as well as with you. First is, I guess we'll do it in speaking order rather than the order in which they're seated. Sarah Mead's going to open up today's event. She's to my two over to my right. She's a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. We stole her away from Education Sector, another independent think tank here, but with their blessing and gratitude from us. She leads our early education effort. Sarah was a senior policy analyst at Education Sector. Prior to that, she worked at the Progressive Policy Institute, which is associated with the Democratic Leadership Council, and prior to that, the Department of Education. She is one of the best young minds in education policy in the country, and we are thrilled to have her. Following Sarah will be Nina Reese. Nina Reese is the, I believe you are Senior Vice President, is that right? At Knowledge Universe, which provides, which is a for-profit company that provides early childhood, after-school training, and so forth. Nina previously was an Assistant Deputy Secretary of Education, responsible for innovative programs at the Department of Education. I think you had 28 grant programs or something like that under you. Prior to that, not only was she actively involved in No Child Left Behind Act authorization in 2001 and I guess 2001. But prior to that, she was, prior to her role at the Department of Education, she was a domestic policy advisor to Vice President Cheney. And Nina, I remember you from back when you were at the Heritage Foundation as a senior policy analyst. At the time, I worked for Senator Pell and then subsequently Senator Kennedy on the No Child Left Behind Act reauthorization. Next speaking will be Amy Wilkins, who is your who's seated three spaces to my right. Amy is a, Amy, are you a senior vice president?
I'm just a plain old vice president.
Oh, well. It's always good to have high aspirations, think something you can aspire to. Amy is a plain old vice president at Education Trust, which is a relatively young school reform organization in Washington, but extraordinarily influential. For those of you who do not know, the untold story behind the No Child Left Behind Act is that Education Trust was a key actor in coming up with the intellectual construct for the legislation back in the mid to late 1990s that was subsequently embraced by Congress. And she is one of the sharpest tongues in Washington education circles. So I asked her to be provocative. She said, no problem. Last but not least is Kathy Patterson. Residents of the District of Columbia may know Kathy from her time on the district city council. Kathy spent 12 years on the council. She also served on the education committee on the council. She joined PreK Now, which is supported by the Pew Charitable Trust, who's also another one of our funders for a different project here at New America, and we're very grateful, Pew Charitable Trust people. PreK Now, which is sort of spearheading much of the universal pre-K movement in the states. Kathy joined in 2007 as their federal policy director, and we're looking forward to her perspectives as well. I'm not going to go on. Last but not least is David Hoff, who is probably the preeminent education journalist for K-12 education in the country right now, whether he wants to admit it or not. Education Week is the go-to trade publication, as most in this room know, not only for advocates, interest groups, but also for major media who then steal David's stories and print them there. We are thrilled to have David Hoff with us. He covered the 1994 authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act called the Improving America's Schools Act. He did not cover the 2001 reauthorization known as No Child Left Behind Act, and he's now covering No Child Left Behind Act 2, which also happens to be the name of his blog. so he has a good perspective in terms of historical sweep, but not being too wedded to the old fights. So I'm thrilled to have you here. We at New America Foundation are education reformers, and we are that because not so much we see failures in the current system, but because we want to make it better. And David, that's my challenge to you with respect to this panel, is to try and get the conversation focused not on the analysis of our failures strictly, but also on ways to improve matters, educational opportunities and achievement for young people from early education through K-12. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I notice this is being recorded. If you could make a copy and send it to my mother, I would really appreciate it. You're far too kind. We are going to follow a very standard format. Sarah is going to present first on her paper. Each of the panelists will respond briefly, and then I'll start it off with a question, maybe two, and open it up. So take it away, Sarah.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Am I on? Okay. When we talk about No Child Left Behind, we typically tend to go straight to focusing on the law's testing and accountability provisions that are focused on students in grades 3 through 8. And we do that for a good reason. It's really the core of NCLB. It's the most controversial portion of the law, and that's what most of the public debate in the press, in Congress recently about reauthorization among candidates on the campaign trail focuses on. But evidence shows that if we're really serious about achieving NCLB's goals of narrowing achievement gaps and improving student learning, that third grade is really too late to really start focusing, that most of the key foundations of basic skills and knowledge that children need have to be in place in third grade already. Inability to read proficiently, do math well by the end of third grade is a very strong predictor of later school failure, negative life outcomes, and researchers estimate that about a third to a half of the achievement gap is already in place by the time children enter first grade. So if we want to achieve NCLB's goals, it's not good enough to start focusing on kids in third grade when they're going to be tested. We really need to look at what happens earlier in the preschool years and early elementary school. NCLB does look at early education. There are a number of provisions in NCLB, a number of programs in NCLB that do impact early education and seek to improve it. I'll just run through a couple right now. The Title I program is a significant source of funding for preschool programs, about 2 to 3% of Title I funds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is a couple $100 million annually, so a significant funding source spent on preschool programs. There's also provisions in Title I that focus on getting schools to work with pre-K programs in their communities to arrange kids' transition. The Even Start program provides family literacy services and early childhood education. The Reading First program focuses very closely, laser-like, on reading improvement, scientifically based literacy instruction in grades K through 3, and then it has a much smaller counterpart, Early Reading First, that can also be used to support pre-K reading programs. And it's not a mistake that NCLB's accountability system doesn't extend down to kindergarten through second grade. There are good reasons experts think that that type of accountability isn't appropriate for kids in those age range, but that means that when policymakers look at NCLB, look at the scope of programs in NCLB, they need to be very diligent in making sure that the focus on accountability in grades 3 through 8 doesn't detract attention from the important programs that we need to have in pre-K, K through 3 education. However, there's been very little attention in the current NCLB reauthorization debate to early education. There's not a lot of discussion about how do NCLB's programs that currently exist, how do the current provisions impact early education, even though they do. There's been very little discussion about how to improve the existing programs to better support early education. And there's been almost no conversation about, if we want to achieve NCLB's goals, what set of policies and programs do we need in place in early education, not just pre-K, but K through 3, in order to get us there. For example, the House Education Committee's draft NCLB legislation earlier this fall contained a number of provisions to improve high schools, improve some of the accountability requirements for high schools, support dropout prevention, etc., but didn't really make any significant changes to NCLB's early childhood provisions and programs, and didn't propose any new programs for early childhood education. Now, there is a concerted effort, and I'm sure Kathy's going to talk to you quite a bit about this later, to insert in NCLB reauthorization a title specifically focused on pre-K education that could have significant funding for universal pre-K programs attached to it. Senators Hillary Clinton and Kit Bond have proposed legislation in the Senate, as well as Robert Casey. Mazie Hirono in the House has proposed legislation that is specifically structured to be an amendment to NCLB legislation that could create this new title in the law. This is an important effort, and we at New America are supportive of this idea, but we don't think that adding an early childhood or pre-K title to NCLB is really adequate to address the need for early childhood education improvement in the law for a couple of reasons. First, simply pre-K alone isn't enough. There's lots of evidence about the positive long-term impact of pre-K programs, but there's also evidence that when children go from a high-quality pre-K program into a substandard elementary school, they can lose a lot of those gains that they made in pre-K programs. And so just focusing on a pre-K title isn't enough. We also need to make sure NCLB includes provisions that focus on improving education in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade between the time when kids are in pre-K and the time that they start to be tested under NCLB's accountability systems. Second, just segregating pre-K into a separate title in NCLB doesn't make a lot of sense, because pre-K is increasingly becoming a core part of our currently K through 12 elementary and secondary education system. About 2/3 of the kids who are in state pre-K programs are being served in public school classrooms. Those kids are in our schools right now, and so the way that NCLB affects elementary schools generally affects those kids. And it's very important that we start looking at the structure of federal education programs in NCLB and really look at, do these programs make sense and work well for a system where pre-K is increasingly part of the core of early elementary school education, and how can we update those provisions to better incorporate pre-K that's in our schools right now. The New America Foundation issue brief that we are releasing today, that you should all have a copy of, offers 10 ideas for how NCLB could better support high-quality early education in pre-K and K through 12. It's not by any means a comprehensive list, and we don't want to suggest it as a limit. And we hopefully will be working with people in this room and people on the Hill to develop additional ideas as NCLB reauthorization moves along. But we do think it's a good jumping off place for a conversation. I don't want to run through all 10 ideas and bore you with that right now, so I'm going to hit on 3 that I think are particularly important and noteworthy. The first one that I want to talk about is the idea of tapping the set-aside that's currently in No Child Left Behind for supplemental educational services and public school choice, and using some of that money to fund high-quality pre-K. For people who aren't necessarily involved in NCLB and elementary and secondary education, a little bit of background. The 2001 No Child Left Behind Act required school districts, when they have schools that are identified for school improvement under No Child Left Behind, schools that have failed to make adequately yearly progress for 2 consecutive years, to set aside a portion of their Title I funds and use those funds to either provide public school choice, the opportunity to transfer to another public school, or supplemental education services, usually after school tutoring, for kids that are attending schools that are in school improvement. And we have evidence that a lot of schools, the requirement was to set aside 20% of funds for that. We have evidence that a lot of school districts aren't using that full 20%. Take-up rates for some of these programs have been quite low. Many school districts don't actually have enough higher performing schools to offer public school choice to all the children who are eligible for it. There's reports anecdotally that some school districts are actively discouraging parents from using these programs for a variety of reasons I won't go into now. And sometimes it can just be difficult for parents to take up those options. I wasn't able to find any figures for nationally the percentage of funds that are being used for SES and public school choice, but a recent report from the Council for Great City Schools said that slightly over 17% of Title I funds, on average among their members, the 100 largest school districts in the country, are being used. So about at least 2 to 3% of the Title I funds that are supposed to be going for SES and public school choice, on average, aren't going to that. And so, sort of thinking about that, what I said was, wouldn't it be great if we could use that money for high-quality pre-K? Right now, we know that about 2 to 3% of Title I funds nationally are being used for high-quality pre-K. If we could devote the money that school districts are supposed to be spending on SES and public school choice to high-quality pre-K, we could double the amount of Title I funding being used to support high-quality pre-K. And that would also address the concern that a lot of people have that SES, public school choice, the focus on grades 3 through 8, might reduce the amount of funds that districts are using to provide pre-K out of Title I. And so that's our proposal, to allow school districts, require them to use the full 20% of funds on SES and public school choice, which currently they're required to do that, but if they don't have enough demand, they don't have to do it. Require them to use the full 20%, but if they can't fulfill that 20%, allow them to use the funds to provide high-quality pre-K to kids, so that they can get up to that full 20%. And we think that this would not only help more kids to get high-quality pre-K, but it might also eliminate an incentive some districts have right now to discourage parents from using public school choice and supplemental education services, because districts would not be able to hold on to that money if take-up is low. Second idea I want to talk about is to allow school districts to use their federal Reading First funds for pre-K literacy improvement. The Reading First program focuses on scientifically based literacy instruction, but it's very specific in the law and the regulations that you can only use these programs for kindergarten through 3rd grade. So if you're a school district and you operate a pre-K program, for kids who are, young Ks who aren't quite ready for kindergarten, or you have funding through your state pre-K program, you, even though those kids might be in the same building, can't use Reading First funds to use the same reading curriculum, the same literacy coaches, etc., the same assessments to improve literacy instruction in your pre-K. And so that not only takes away resources that could be used to improve literacy instruction in pre-K, but it also creates a fracture and a difficulty in aligning instruction across the pre-K through 3 continuum, which we know is really important so that kids' skills build year to year and they have a consistent educational experience. And so we're simply proposing that you change the legislation. It's really as simple as changing the word kindergarten to the word pre-kindergarten in the Reading First legislation. Pretty simple change, would allow pre-K programs to benefit from some of the $1 billion in federal funds used on Reading First, and would help school districts align reading curriculum from pre-K through 3rd grade. Pretty straightforward. The final idea I want to talk about today is the idea of allowing and encouraging elementary schools that have gotten to the reconstitution point in the school improvement process, encouraging them to restructure themselves as pre-K through grade 3 early education academies. Under NCLB, if a school fails to make adequate yearly progress for 6 years, then it has to be reconstituted. And the law offers a series of options for how to reconstitute that school: conversion to a charter school, closing the school and reopening it, etc. It's supposed to be a major governance change in the operation of the school. Now, unfortunately, the law also included the option of other, and when we look at what schools that have gotten to the reconstitution phase are doing, most of them are doing other, which in a lot of cases isn't all that much. And in states like Michigan, where they had been further along in their school improvement timeline, you have schools that have now been in reconstitution for years, multiple years, and don't seem to be changing much. So the idea behind the early education academies for elementary schools is to encourage this strategy, which would turn them into an early education academy starting at age 3 with high-quality preschool, pre-K, full-day kindergarten, going through grade 3 with an aligned curriculum, supportive professional development, etc. And we think this is a good idea for a couple reasons. One, it just provides a coherent vision for comprehensive school reform in these schools, which is something that's lacking in a lot of schools that are in reconstitution right now. Second, it would provide additional resources and supports, high-quality preschool, pre-K, full-day kindergarten, that those kids really need in the early years to help get them up to grade level. And third, we have some evidence that this is a strategy that can be effective. If you look at Jean Maroff's recent book, Building Blocks, also the National Association of Elementary School Principals has done a series of profiles on schools that are using this pre-K-3 strategy to build schools that are improving, and examples of schools that have used this strategy to move from low-performing to successful schools. We also think this could ultimately be a way to improve kids' access to school choice, because one of the things that you could do if you're moving from a K-5 school to a PK3 academy would be move the kids in that school in 4th and 5th grade to the front of the line for public school choice options to transfer to a higher performing school in the district. You could also make that a separate school within a school. There's lots of other options for what could be done to improve education for those kids as well. That's just a quick overview of 3 ideas. I hope that you'll read the paper, follow up with me if you have questions about other ideas, and hopefully discuss some of them further in the conversation following this.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. We're going to start with Nina in response.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Sarah and David, for hosting this event. Let me tell you a little bit about the company that I work for, Knowledge Universe. We own a company called Knowledge Learning Corps, which acquired Children's Discovery Centers in 1983. Later, Children's Discovery Centers merged with Children's World Learning Centers in 2003. And last year we acquired, or 2 years ago, we acquired KinderCare. So right now, our company runs roughly 2,000 centers around the country, early childhood and daycare centers, and about 25% of our students are subsidized in one shape or form. I read Sarah's paper with great interest, not just because of our company's investments in pre-K, but also because of my past experience with NCLB, both as someone who helped pass it and help implement some of its provisions, but also as the mother of a 2.5-year-old. So I love being able to associate my own personal experience as the mother of a preschooler to a policy issue that I'm working on. So I have 5 general thoughts or observations about the paper. The first one is something that I'm sure is going to come up from our other panelists, which is just this whole discomfort that you may sense from the pre-K advocates in this room and elsewhere with tying NCLB closely with pre-K, which may be why a lot of the proposals on the table currently are separate line items and titles added into NCLB rather than weaving a pre-K within the different titles. And this is unfortunate. I happen to be a huge fan of No Child Left Behind, but as you recall, a few weeks ago, the Washington Post did a wonderful article kind of overview of the status of NCLB, and I recall Congressman Miller quoted towards the end saying something along the lines of, if NCLB were a commodity, probably no one would want to buy it right now. So you are unfortunately confronting a lot of these unfortunate dynamics, which will make it difficult, in my opinion, to get the pre-K advocates to get to the table to really talk in a comprehensive way about ways to weave in some of these policy ideas within the core of NCLB. And so while you're saying that NCLB and the testing and accountability provisions are separate from your proposals down the road, that is a question that a lot of people will want to find out more about. Why would you not want to expand those provisions into pre-K if Title I funds and other funds in ESCA are being used for pre-K? Another reason why I think NCLB and ESCA may not be a good source of funding for early childhood is perhaps because of the way these funding streams currently are constructed. They go primarily to school districts, which then disseminate them to public schools. And in the early childhood area, most of the funding at the state and federal level tend to be channeled through the Departments of Health and Human Services or Social Services. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best place, but perhaps creating some hybrids or some other entities that can merge the education piece with the care piece may be a better venue to send funds to early childhood centers around the country. So again, the big question on the table is if you, with Title I, is it best for Title I to be expanded into pre-K and take on this whole new responsibility in a more robust and serious way, or would it not be best for Title I to continue really focusing on those early grades and making sure that it's doing the best that it can within K through 6 or beyond, and for some other entity with less bureaucracy perhaps to take the role of overseeing creation of high-quality pre-K programs that are at the same time aligned with kindergarten and beyond. So that's just something to think about. The second point I wanted to make, which Sarah didn't mention in her talk, but the one that I thought was the most interesting, is her idea of creating these different pathways for pre-K teaching. And she didn't really get into the details much, but whenever I'm traveling, as much as I can, I try to go visit one of our early childhood centers, and I always try to ask the center directors what they think about this idea of requiring a BA degree or certain certification and credentials of the people who are with these with their preschoolers, and regardless of their background and degree and qualifications, almost all of them usually say that they would prefer to hire people who really love working with children and put them through the training that they need and the education that they need to succeed in the classroom. So in my opinion, just having that in the back of your mind as we're trying to talk about creating high-quality pre-K programs is very important, especially at a time when you are dealing with a lot of teacher shortages in regular classrooms. Do you want your high-quality teachers to be teaching fourth graders or 4-year-olds? And this is also a pretty interesting and important point to keep in mind, because pre-K is at that interesting crossroads between care and education. So whoever you bring into these classrooms is going to have to be patient enough to still blow those kids' noses and give them naps and deal with temper tantrums, and also be able to teach them the skills that they need to succeed in kindergarten and beyond. So leaving some flexibility in there for the center directors to make some decisions about who they bring in, I think, is important, at least at this point in time. The third point I wanted to make is more of an idea for Sarah to maybe include as an 11th recommendation on our paper, which is the importance of building in strong outreach and education components to whatever pre-K proposal we draft. I say this partly because if you look at Head Start and CCDF and even SES to some extent, these are still, pre-K is still a voluntary program. If you really want to reach the community that you're trying to attract to these programs, you have to invest greatly, in my opinion, in proper outreach and education to those families whose kids need this help the most. I saw that firsthand with SES. We continue to see it everywhere. The families whose kids tend to benefit the most from SES are not the ones who are going to sign up for SES first. It's not because they don't care, but their schedules are different. They don't often read the same literature that other families read. So I think it's important to really focus on this component so long as pre-K is a voluntary program. And one program to perhaps tweak or think about in terms of this outreach and education, maybe the Parent Information Resource Center program, which is already in place. The fourth point I wanted to make really goes at the kind of the core of what we're discussing today, which is the need to focus our energies more on initiatives that will really help us close the achievement gap as early as possible. So if that's really the ultimate goal, the bulk of the research out of Harvard and other places seems to indicate that 70% of brain development happens between the years 0 to 3. So in terms of, again, investing in the right types of programs that prepare kids for the challenges of schooling, again, it's important for us to also take into consideration what sorts of funding streams and help we need to provide for those years to make sure that kids are perhaps then ready to start pre-K, ready to learn. And last but not least, where does the private sector and the community sector fit in the grand scheme of things? Right now, our K-12 funding stream does not go into private schools, although there are provisions in different titles that allow for equitable participation in private schools for low-income kids. So that's one way to look at it if we wanted to really expand NCLB and ESEA into pre-K. The other way to look at it perhaps is adding priorities to encourage the private sector to join hands with public schools to offer the services. But I think it's a pretty important point, and one that actually gets neglected, in my opinion, in discussions at the state level as well. It's partly because this industry is very fragmented, and most of the center directors are busy just running their centers, which is a good thing. and they don't have time to call legislators or follow the news, the policy discussions in this area. But increasingly, as we're talking about pre-K issues, I think it's important to talk a little bit more with the practitioners. Our organization is actually a member of the Early Care and Education Consortium. Dr. Eric Krolak. Eric, why don't you stand up or wave your hand there? He's the head of the consortium, and he has been working very closely with our company and a few of the other companies in this field to help kind of connect our experiences as practitioners with those of policymakers. So hopefully that dialogue will continue.
Thank you, Nina. And Amy, it's your turn.
Oh, sure, thanks. Can I over here? Excuse me. Like Nina, I'm a big fan of NCLB. Like Nina, I'm not sure that pre-K is making a big bargain, hitching its wagon to this star right now. Nobody's in a very good mood about this law. But unlike Nina, my kid has just finished pre-K. And so I have a kindergartner and get very clearly how important pre-K is to starting kids off strong. I think that the paper may have sort of started with the wrong premise. While I absolutely agree that the federal government needs to do more to leverage the availability of high-quality pre-K, particularly for low-income kids and kids of color, I feel like the premise the paper started with is what can we do that'll cost the federal government little or no money. And I think that's the wrong end of the telescope to look through. I mean, I think we need to keep our eye on the prize, figure out what we want for these kids, and then figure out what the most appropriate role for the federal government is in getting there. And I'm not sure that these recommendations are really the most powerful levers that the federal government has to deliver what we know kids need. I want to suggest that at least one of the levers that we should look to the federal government for is more really good research and development around pre-K programs. When Sarah talked and when Nina talked, you know, and we all do this, we throw the word high quality in front of pre-K like sort of, you know, like knee-jerk. There is and we all know this, there is a lot going on out there that is not very good. And it is not because the providers are ill-intentioned. It is really that we know that it helps. We're not always sure what helps most. You know, the federal government now is engaged in a study of various pre-K curriculum to find out sort of which curriculum are more effective. All we know right now is having a curriculum is more effective than not having a curriculum. I mean, we really should look at what curriculum work. We should look at what instructional strategies work. We should look at what materials are really effective with these kids so that when we talk about high quality pre-K, we really are delivering good stuff to them. I think that Sarah is absolutely 100% right that we have to figure out how to get more ELL kids into pre-K programs, but the fact is we don't know what to do with them once they get there. The research on what you do to help you know, young English language learners acquire English language skills, you know, well and quickly is crappy. I think the federal government needs to quickly make a very big investment in figuring out how we serve these kids much better. So I would, you know, if I had my druthers, I would make a big stink about more R&D money from the federal government to figure out real. You see, I mean, and largely due to the good work of pre-K Now and other organizations, you see this sort of pre-K stuff spreading like wildfire out in the states. But some of what the states are doing makes me a little nervous. And I think we need to figure out how to get good practice out to these people. The other thing I think we need to look at a lot is effective professional development models. We're hearing a lot about more professional development for pre-K teachers, but we're not so sure what's good and what's working. So I think we need to look at that as well. I want to just take a little minute to talk about the recommendations that Sarah mentioned. First, let me talk about what I like. I think including pre-K data in statewide data systems is fabulously important and really needs to happen. I worry, however, about including the assessment data in there because if you don't have statewide sort of standard assessments, you're including, you know, one kind of assessment from one program and another kind of assessment from another program, and you're going to get kind of a hash. So I'm not sure that we're at the stage yet where you can really legitimately say that pre-K assessment data is a valuable part of state data system. But nonetheless, we should begin getting kids into the statewide data system sooner. On the pathways to teaching stuff, I think we really are, we're kind of like where nursing was several decades ago. I mean, we're building a new profession here with pre-K teachers. And I think as we build this profession, looking at it from my perspective as somebody who spends a lot of time worrying about how poor kids get the shaft in K-12, We have to figure out how we don't make the same mistakes in pre-K that we made in K-12, and how we get distribution patterns very different in pre-K to assure that our most qualified and effective teachers are working with the kids who need them most. And so we can't just sort of go along the path that K-12 has in producing and distributing teachers. We need to take this opportunity to do something very different. So as you sort of think about, there are two recommendations around teachers, teacher quality and teacher sort of pathways into the classroom. I think we need to think larger and think kind of how we leverage something very different and can therefore model for K-12 about how they might get their act together. The SES set-aside for pre-K worries me. From a pre-K point of view, I think it's a really unstable funding source, you know, because it depends on how many schools go into school improvement and how many kids are taking advantage of SES services. I mean, I think we should be bold and just say we want money for this. We shouldn't depend on leftovers from SES. Reading first down to pre-K, again, not so much, thanks much, Sarah. You know, we should make early reading first into the program. We want it to be. And when you say these recommendations, you know, either cost nothing or little, it does cost money to stretch these funds that are supposed to serve kids in kindergarten and third grade down to younger kids. I mean, it means less services for the kids who are older, and we can't afford less services for kids in kindergarten through third grade who are struggling with reading. We shouldn't take from one set of kids to give to another. We just need, pie needs to grow. Last, I can't read my handwriting. So maybe I should stop there and like do more stuff in the Q&A, but thank you very much.
Kathy?
I'm going to stand up because I can't talk sitting down or can't talk or spread papers out. I'm Kathy Patterson from PreK Now, and for those of you who don't know, we support state campaigns for high quality, that word again, voluntary pre-K all around the country, where, as it was noted, we've seen huge increases in state support for pre-K. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want to comment. As each person spoke, I kept making new notes of new things I wanted to say, and just comment on a couple of the things that were said and then go back to the original proposals. Sarah mentioned Title I as a significant source of funding for pre-K. Yes, that is true, but at the state and local level, each one of those dollars that goes toward pre-K is hard fought. And I agree with Amy, we do need new funding sources. Even Start, also a source of funding, but was zeroed out in the Senate appropriations. Again, we need to look at some additional funding sources. Nina mentioned who distributes pre-K money at the state level. A lot of the school systems that have pre-K money, in fact, do contract with private providers. So what we build on out in the states is a diverse delivery system, and that's something that we need to maintain in terms of moving forward on all and any of these ideas. We, too, look at federal legislation and look at everywhere it says kindergarten, whether we should change it to pre-K, and try to decide yes and no whether it does make sense. But I think having a new title for pre-kindergarten in our federal law, that's an and/or. We also need to go through each of the titles as was suggested and thread and figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make as much sense in terms of our pre-kindergarten initiatives. I was delighted to see recommendations 2 and 4. These are the two that Sarah touched on that talk about including pre-kindergarten within the structure of NCLB's reform initiatives, and this is something that we had recommended earlier, but I think what you recommend is in fact an improvement on what we had recommended. We had said simply that the accountability provisions in 1116 be amended to let schools, LEAs, and states initiate or expand high-quality pre-K, and we suggested that it be an intervention permitted in the school improvement, corrective action, and whole school reform sections. I think what you're suggesting as we came to look at NCLB, if the whole structure of the law is based on doing what we know high-quality pre-K is an intervention that works for children, and so should not this law be also supportive of pre-kindergarten? And that was what we came to in our initial NCLB advocacy earlier this year. The idea of funding academies, pre-K through 3 academies, I think is a very valuable suggestion, because I think that does help address the issue of high-quality pre-K followed by poor quality K-12. And if that can be a model that school systems look at, I think that's something that then does get the school reform agenda on the right track in terms of starting where you need to start with our youngest learners, but also making sure you don't then dump them out of a high quality pre-K system into a poor quality K-12. In terms of the teacher provisions, we also agree that high quality should apply to pre-K teachers every bit as much as it does to K-12. And I want to thank the Ed Trust and Amy for continuing to hammer on the issue of high quality teachers for our most vulnerable populations. I think that's an important contribution. I appreciate that you continue to make that point. It's one we do need to continue to consider. We have strongly supported quality, part of the definition, as being a BA degree for pre-K teachers, and that's something that, yes, we're very open to alternative ways of getting there as interims, as alternatives, but without losing rigor and without losing the goal of a pre-K workforce where the teachers, lead teachers in each classroom has a BA degree, as well as the ongoing staff development in early education. It is important to sort out what the federal role should be with regard to early education. And where I want to take exception with the whole paper comes to these are very constructive suggestions, but they're in fact at the margins. And I think we need, as children's advocates, to really be bold and to say we need to go for the gold, and I mean that very literally. We need sizable federal investment of new funds for our children. That agenda includes moving forward on the pre-K legislation. We had hoped to see Clinton bond on the Senate side. We'd hoped to see the Hirono bill on the House side and markup on reauthorization of NCLB. But since NCLB seems stymied by some of the tougher issues of accountability and workforce performance, we want to move forward smartly on separate standalone legislation and invite all of your support for doing so. It seems to me that it's not too much to look to the Ed and Labor Committee and the Help Committee to move forward on the standalone legislation, since they are also drafted as standalone legislation. I think it's also important for Congress to understand that it would also be very good politics. It's not an accident that 30 governors, 29 governors over the last year have supported pre-K. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also very smart politically. And if I were in a legislative body that had failed to enact 12 of 13 appropriations bills, I might want to look for something good and popular to do in the wake of that. A second part of a much more bold agenda would be to look at appropriations overall. We're going to have, as kids advocates over the next couple of years, a couple of huge opportunities for, again, going for the gold. The Urban Institute's work has informed our knowledge of the need to change direction in kids' investments because they're going downhill. We're going to have those 2010 and those tax cuts are going to come back before the Congress. And we, as children's advocates, need to be there ahead of line and say, look, those revenues need to go toward kids. We do not need to be in this fight every year, Head Start versus Title I versus child care versus everything else that we know we need to do for kids. And similarly, at some point, our investments in the war will be decreasing, we hope, and that's another point in time in the near future where we as children's advocates can be looking towards a greater federal investment in our kids. And I just challenge us to think big and to talk big, and a big stick never hurts, but I think it's something we need to be talking about going forward, is beginning to build a case, as we discuss NCLB, building a case for much deeper, broader, wider investments in our kids. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for really, I think, great and provocative comments. I'd like to give you a chance, Sarah, to respond, and I'd particularly like to ask you to respond to the the idea that, or at least the question that whether or not these suggestions in your paper are sufficient, and whether or not they should be part of a bigger agenda, and whether doing these might distract from a larger agenda on pre-K issues.
Sure, and that's actually the point that I sort of was most interested to address following the comments. I don't want anybody to be under the misapprehension that we think this is a complete agenda for early childhood education. We don't. People who are familiar with my work know that I've written several papers in the past calling for a very large new federal investment in high-quality pre-K programs through the states, and that's something that I believe in and that New America very much believes in. But two things. One, this is a debate that lots of people are already participating in. We felt that our resources would be better used, not necessarily being an additional voice in that particular debate, but looking at some specific ways other parts of NCLB right now in a pragmatic fashion, separate from this broader discussion, could be made more supportive of early education. We don't in any way see these things as conflicting. We see them as supporting each other. We think both are good things to do, and that's sort of where these ideas are coming from. At the same time, we do think that some of the ideas that we're proposing here can form a potential bridge for getting to the places that people want to go in terms of a larger federal investment. In particular, our proposal for the 2020 early education grants to states for repurposing the money that's now in the Title V block grant program is really designed around the idea that you use this money to help states build a structure that can then become a vehicle for a much larger federal investment down the road. And it's specifically modeled after Goals 2000, which did that in terms of creating state structures around standards that then became a vehicle for larger federal funding in further reauthorizations of ESEA. So we definitely see those two things as working together, and these ideas as helping to pave a path towards that and putting in place some of the structures that get us there, as opposed to a diversion from that agenda.
And what about your second recommendation that low-performing schools rely on money that's now set aside for SES and choice? We've heard from Nina that school districts don't like to give that money up to providers right now. Would they want to give it up for pre-K? And we hear from Amy that perhaps this is an unstable funding source, something that depends on the number of schools in need of improvement, for instance.
Sure, and I do want to be clear that we are not proposing that as something that we think should be the cornerstone of federal policy around early childhood education, or something that early childhood providers or the early childhood movement should be relying on. The goal was really twofold. One was to address exactly the issue that Nina raised, that school districts don't like giving up that money for choice in SES. The goal here was to say, okay, right now they actually have some outs in policy. They can say, well, not enough people really wanted it, there aren't enough providers, there aren't enough good schools, so we can't really spend 20% of the money. The goal was to sort of take that off the table and say, look, we're going to give you another option. We know you could definitely spend the whole 20% on that option, so we'll give you those three options, and you have to spend that 20%. Some of that can be on pre-K, but you've got to spend it on those three things to remove that out that school districts currently have and address the problem that you were raising. To Amy's point, that is a potential concern, and if we were proposing this in a vacuum as sort of the only thing that was out there for a federal policy around early education, and states weren't doing lots of things already on early ed, that would be something I would be concerned about. The fact that there are other things going on is one reason I'm not concerned about it. The fact that I do think that there's a need to make early childhood programs part of the intervention for low-performing schools is an important piece of why we made that recommendation. And I also think there is an issue of inertia in place. If a school district, starts using this money to provide high-quality preschool, once you start providing a program that a lot of parents and people in the community like, it gets really hard to take it away, and there may be some inertia creating some additional stability and making it harder for school districts to cut some of those pre-K programs, particularly if Title I funding continues to rise.
Would anyone on the panel want to add anything based on what Sarah said?
I just wanted to address the SES piece because I think I talked about it earlier when we were talking and not in the context of my comments. I actually think that the proposal is a great incentive for districts to spend the money on choice and SES because doing the specific things in this paper are difficult. I also want to take issue with Mike Casserly's note that 17% of the Title I funding is being spent on choice and SES or on SES because I think it was the Title I longitudinal study or the GAO last year that demonstrated most of them are spending less than 5%. So maybe, again, the concentration of districts that Mike represents spend more of that funding, but most of them are not spending the funding. So I think it's an effective stick, but if it were to be implemented, say in a state like Georgia, I was having this conversation with Eric the other day, Georgia has a UPK program. A lot of people believe it's a pretty robust and high-quality program, but they don't require a BA degree or they don't mandate it, even though a lot of the teachers in these centers do have BA degrees. So, how you juxtapose the federal mandate with the current reality in a state like Georgia and other states that have a pre-K, targeted pre-K program or UPK program is something to be discussed if we were really serious about implementing that provision.
I want to be clear that I truly think that expanding access to pre-K for low-income kids is probably one of the most important things we can do. However, I really take exception to the idea of pre-K as an intervention in 1116 of NCLB. 1116 is the sort of sanction section, what happens when a school gets into trouble. It would be, and Sarah mentioned that the other option is there in the law, so a lot of state school districts don't do much when they find a school that gets into real trouble. If you allow school districts to sort of turn away from the K-12 schools, the K-6 schools that are in trouble and say, what we are going to do is focus on pre-K and really fix pre-K, we're going to do more pre-K in our community, you've just said to them, you don't need to deal with these screwy K-12 schools. It is absolutely an important part of, pre-K is an important part of getting kids on the road to academic success, but it is not a substitute for dealing with K-12 schools that repeatedly fail kids. So we have to, absolutely have to provide these kids pre-K, but providing pre-K can't be an out for dealing with the failures of K-12. No.
And I would agree with that and did not mean to suggest otherwise. I want to make a slightly broader point about federal policy and how it can impact at the state and local level. One of the things I think we want to look to federal policy is to help strengthen the hands of folks at the state and local level who really are serious about reforming schools. And one of the advantages of permitting some of the funding streams within NCLB to go toward pre-K through 3 academies or other kinds of or early good quality early education is in fact to strengthen those hands at the state and local level who want to do that and with a federal nudge might be better enabled to do that. One of the facts we look at when we look at the robust investments in pre-K at the state level is yes, the state dollars are up, but the per capita, the per child dollars nationally are trending down. And that's a very significant red flag. And one of the things we would like to look to federal policy is to really ratchet up what the quality looks like.
I do want to really quickly just go back to Amy's point about Section 1116, because that is important, and that was something that we were concerned about and wanted to make sure to avoid doing, and that's why, for example, we didn't make a proposal that pre-K should be part of the menu of corrective actions. We tried to keep it very much in the issue with SES and public school choice, which are both about things outside of the school that needs improvement, about giving kids beyond it. And then when we made it part of our recommendations for reconstitution, to really tie that to things that would also improve the early elementary school years as well.
I guess my concern, now we're going to the K-3 Academy stuff, I guess my concern is sort of both in the way the paper dealt with it and the way you talked about it. It was, when schools go into reconstitution, one of the options could be to create pre-K-3 academy, and we'll figure out something to do with those 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. As you think about that, you can't just sort of say, we'll figure out those kids later. What happens to those kids are in the school that was failing them. You can't just say, we're going to reconstitute that school and send these kids who have been gypped academically, they're the next thing we think about.
I think we're ready to open it up for questions. Is there a microphone or not? Just stand up and shout. Just stand up and shout. Go ahead.
My name is Olivia Messier, and I think I'm the only architect here, so this is my qualification. However, my family is a family of educators, and I've spent the last 25 years working with educators in 4 continents, which is a long time. So we talk often, we form a kind of consortium of educators in our house, and we often talk about the experiences in various classrooms. And we have identified one of the major problems, which is not only the current decline in reading proficiency, but the fact that once a student becomes proficient, he's not likely to become a citizen that reads. And we think this is the source of many, many problems. And we think that the source of this problem is not post-K, and it has to be pre-K, and it's probably X-school. So I have a proposal. I'm not going to propose a new institution, not even a new point, a new ID, but I would like to propose, if Ms. Reese agrees, to tack on to her 11th point, support stream funding for her outreach. And the proposal I'm going to make is I'd like to set it on a three-legged stool, and I will give you a quick reference to each one of those three legs.
Well, if there are other people who want to make comments or have questions, so if you could please
I'll be quick.
get to your
I'll be
question,
quick.
please.
But I do need to make these references. I'll make them very quickly. The first is pediatricians who have for 2.5 years done research that seems to demonstrate that there is a link between exposure of toddlers to the television medium, and they emphasize medium, not content, and ADHD. And the American Pediatrics Academy, which has warned parents to keep children under 2 away from television sets. The second leg is educators. The American College Test pointed out that the decline in reading proficiency is across all groups. So we should be looking for a common factor. And the third leg is the database of the Kaiser Family Foundation, which, for instance, points out that 42% of children under 3 years old spend 2 hours a day before television, and that 19% of children under 2 have televisions in their bedrooms. So I come to my conclusion and to my proposal. So I propose that within this 11th point, if you can work it out, I'd like to propose support, interdisciplinary support, because when I talk to an educator, he tells me I don't understand brains. If I talk to a neurobiologist, he will say reading proficiency is not in my bailiwick. So support interdisciplinary, including parents, research that would verify the hypothesis that there is a causal link between reading proficiency, between the decline of reading proficiency across all groups.
Okay.
And I'm finishing my sentence. And the viewing of the television medium by children under 2. That's my proposal. Thank you. And I would love to have your comments, of course, any one of you. And I think I wrote to Michael Landing,
okay,
I sent him an email.
Okay, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you as well, David, but we have a lot of people here who want to ask questions. I want all questions in the future to please get right to the question. No opening comments, right to your question. You have 2 sentences. And I paid for this microphone, and I'll throw you out if you don't take the 2 sentences.
I did send you an email. Okay?
Go ahead.
Oh, response? I mean, Olivia is from France, the land of pre-K, so I'm sure it's a fine idea, but I think your idea is probably better tacked on to Amy's concept of more R&D in this area than on my little outreach and parent education piece. So.
Other questions? Brett?
I think we're confronted with that continual conundrum for early childhood. The piece on education and what are the other services, I think Kathy's point, broader, wider investments in kids is the important piece. So the question then goes, and it was raised in Sarah's piece, talking about the structural programs within NCLB or other things and update the provisions. What should the architecture be of the statute to think about? Because none of this talked about the linkage with the other programs that support, that kids need and support. We've only talked about the education component. Well, I didn't stump you.
I'm not sure what the question is.
For instance, your question to go how to go beyond education and into
Well,
other services
I think
that
the
young
problem
kids
is,
need?
I think the problem is we can not only talk about education if you're going to solve this, if you're going to address the problem of the population. So, is the architecture of the legislation have to change? We talked about provisions and we talked about programs. Does it have to change? Do we have to change our mindset on how we do this? Because the old conundrum which we faced just now with Head Start reauthorization was education, developmental.
Right.
Is it the linkage piece, or do we have to now rethink what we're doing in the legislation? What we've done with NCLB is, okay, we got this law, now we got to fix the parts.
Yeah.
We haven't rethought the whole architecture of our programs since 1965.
Maybe, but I think we should at least take a shot at fully funding the programs we've authorized already. And I think there's one really good, hopeful thing coming out of the Head Start reauthorization, to your point, and that's the sort of mandated creation of the state advisory councils, early learning councils, and I'm hoping, some states are already doing a very good job at collaborating and sort of taking what federal funding streams there are and sort of trying to make them work for kids, and it seems to me this is one that states can run with and I hope, make better use of and better collaboration. But I'm still not sure we're getting to your question. So I'm not sure I'm getting to your question.
No, I was going to say exactly what Kathy said. I think that the hopefulness of the new Head Start bill is this, real, I think, on Senator Kennedy's part, intentional collaboration and coordination at the state level. I'm not sure that the federal government can create the kind of architecture you're talking about, Fritz, but the idea of funds flowing into states for various different, because we're still doing all this stuff in silos. And states having a stronger coordinating role to figure out how you bring all those pieces together to serve well all the parts that children are, I think is hopeful and necessary.
I'm going to make a plug for some other work that's going on here at New America, which is two pieces. One, our Family and Workforce Initiative, which is doing a lot more work broadly looking at children's well-being and a broader range of programs that support children. And I think that work, which is now primarily looking at descriptive research about the condition of children, could be the beginning of a bridge to some broader efforts like you're describing, Fritz. I also think we have a Next Social Contract initiative that, as our education plan and as our workforce and family plans roll out, and also as our budget people start looking at some of how these programs relate together in our federal budget, we'll start to get at and address that. But those questions, I think, are well beyond the scope of what we're raising in this conversation. So check out our Next Social Contract stuff in the next year or so.
In the back.
Hi, Jennifer Johnson with the U.S. Chamber. I recognize that the topic of today is really using NCLB reauthorization. But let's just say that the reauthorization doesn't take force, it doesn't move forward, okay? There are many of us in this room that are really looking at that. But hypothetically, if that doesn't move forward, how do you take these ideas and fashion some other type of legislation or even other ideas for pre-K, either universal pre-K? So what about that particular agenda?
Well, I will just repeat myself. I'm hoping that we can see the Congress move forward with on the Senate side, the Casey Bond bill, and on the House side, the Hirono bill, to create a new federal quality-focused incentive grant for pre-kindergarten to support the work that states are already undertaking. That's certainly something that we're going to be pushing, and hope we have folks in the room who will join us in doing that, because I think that is one step forward that we can make.
Kathy, just for clarification, you are pushing for that amendment outside. If the NCLB reauthorization doesn't move forward, you would want to see that amendment move separately in the next year?
Absolutely. The legislation on both sides of the Hill there is legislation that it was introduced as standalone legislation with the idea that it would become a part of an amendment to a title of No Child Left Behind. But if the broader reauthorization is stymied or stuck in committee, I think those are vehicles that the committees could themselves schedule hearings on and move forward with. There are different approaches, but in the sense of getting federal dollars in support of high-quality pre-K, they're consistent on that point. And I would relish the opportunity of working with a conference committee on, pulling together the Clinton Bond and the Hirono bills.
Question over here.
This is a question for any of you. I'm just curious, how important do you think it is to make sure that low-income students aren't clustered in all of the same pre-K classrooms to make sure that they're in an integrated environment?
Basically, how important is it to have the low-income students not clustered together in the same classroom and more integrated with upper-income students? Amy, why don't you?
I'll respond to it.
Okay. The research suggests that when you vary class within a pre-K program, that the low-income kids, generally the kids with lower skills, benefit from being in the same room as more affluent kids. So, yeah, it's a good idea. I think that what we have to deal with, however, is, serious segregation patterns in most communities. And so we can't sort of let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we have to figure out how to deliver high-quality services to kids where they are. What we know about pre-K, even more than K-12, is parents, location matters a lot when you look at why people pick where they pick. And often people want to pick, they tend to pick near their home more than near their work, which is one of the reasons that school-based and workplace childcare didn't ever work out so well. But if people are going to pick near their neighbor, near their homes, and we have housing segregation, you just know that you are going to have, deep economic segregation in these programs. But that does not mean for a minute that you don't, just inject those programs with the best quality you can. Which is why, again, going back to my earlier point about teacher quality, we can't work ourselves into a situation where we have pre-K programs in high-poverty communities staffed by the least able teachers.
Just sort of piggybacking on that, I actually have seen this sort of firsthand, being some of the issues about parents wanting to be near their home in a preschool that I'm on the board of. That it's really hard. We have two different campuses, and one of our campuses was oversubscribed, and almost nobody wanted to move from the oversubscribed campus to one at the other end of the metro line that had spaces because it was too far from their home. So it's a challenge. I do think that one thing that we can do that's important is, despite the caveats that Amy has about sort of parents want it to be near their home and not where they work, if we can sort of break out of the sort of place-based way of assigning kids to programs as we're designing these new pre-K structures, so that parents do have the option of putting their kids somewhere near where they work, since we know people work in places that are much more integrated than where they live, that may be one way to start getting at some of that, even though, as Amy says, it's nowhere near a solution.
Can I just, this is one sort of anecdotal thing just to throw on that, Sarah. In one of my previous lives, I used to organize office workers, secretaries, just labor organizer, and we did a lot of advocacy on work-based childcare. And what the women told us is, we don't want that. The only time we get in the day to ourselves is our subway ride or our bus ride, and we don't want the kid with us. We read the newspaper, we read our novel. So I mean, people choose childcare near their home for a reason. It's a little mommy time in the day.
Go back there. Okay, you.
Danielle Yoen from the Center for Law and Social Policy. I'm interested by this conversation because it seems like we're talking about something that is happening in our heads but takes no account of what's actually happening on the ground. And Michael, your two sentences not, just give me another second. We know that Title I can already do all the things you all talked about. So I think Amy's point about let's think outside the box, let's think bigger, is more important to this conversation. And Sarah, really I would challenge you to think about where kids currently are. Kids who are 4 and 3 and 0 are places now. We know most kids are in some kind of childcare setting. We know most of them are crap. We know most of them aren't doing outreach to LEP families. We know immigrant families who are the largest growing group of children under 5 are not served by these programs. We know that schools are not trusted by a lot of these families, but community providers are. So how can we really think about an early education proposal that breaks out of NCLB and really thinks about how to get money to kids and families where they are that meets their needs? So I would challenge the panel to talk about that.
I don't have anything in particular to add in response to that, although I do want to be clear that this is work that we will be doing in terms of looking at the shape of federal investment, proposing new federal investment in the coming year around early education and some other education issues as part of our next social contract initiative. This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the last word from us on what the federal role in investing in early education should be. So we will start doing that, and I'll probably want to talk to you because the work that you've done on Title I and some of the other pre-K work you've done is excellent at CLASP.
Thank you. I'm Lois Ted from Concerned Citizens. And God forbid that a program should be the answer to our children, 0 to 5 or whatever. Where's the parental responsibility? You're supposed to love the child more than anything, more than the job. If it's necessary, cut back and you train your child to where you want him to be and put him where you want to. I don't think dependence on government programs are what I would call bad things. To walk into a baby factory with babies, 20 to 30 of them in there and 5 people to take care of them is awful. To put that to any child. And if I don't know you or where you're coming from, I don't want you with my child. I'll bring him myself to where he needs to be, and I have done that. We need something to inspire learned parents to educate them to educate their own, if possible. This is possible, I believe. And for you to say, to put it all into pre-K, that's asinine. You have to have some for the K through grade level. We can train them. What can you do to help your own child or inspire parents to train their own to where they need to be? Because you got it too messed up to put it into government hands.
You know, I think, what, four of us up here are living that life right now in various stages of development. And but I think your previous questioner's point is a good one, in that is most children are in some sort of care someplace, so it does lead to a question of policy. Anyone else?
Can I just one point? As we bandy around the term high quality for early education for pre-K, one of the hallmarks of quality, one of the definitions of quality has to do with parents. And when you find a really wonderful child care center or pre-K program sponsored by the government, funded by the government, what have you, it will be one that not only has parents there, but has things for parents as well, so that it's sort of an iterative process. The parent brings the child, but also is very much a part of what happens in that center or in that school, whether it's a literacy program for that parent, him or herself. I mean, the parental involvement is key to programs that are in fact quality.
And can I just say I think, there are lots of things that parents can teach kids, and there are lots of things that we should support parents in teaching their kids, but one of the things that parents can't teach their kids is being in a big group with other kids and responding to people who are their teachers. And so pre-K is, when you talk about why pre-K is important, it is the social and emotional development of kids learning how to operate in a classroom environment. And no matter how much you love your child or how involved you are with your child, you can't yourself teach them that.
So one more question, right in front here.
Hi, Miriam Calderon. I'm with the National Council of Nebraska, and I just wanted to just mention just reactions to some of these points, and I'll get to a question as well as some of the proposals.
Actually, can you just give us your question right away? Because we've already run long on time.
Thank you, Amy, for raising English language learners, but the reality is these are the kids that are in the programs. And the reality is that a lot of these things on this list and the relevant legislation right now is going to do nothing to improve the education of these kids. We're all focused on them in 3 through 8, and 80% of them are coming through in our pre-K programs. And a lot of these proposals and the legislation that's been introduced on early childhood education isn't going to improve the experience of English language learners in preschool. So what role does Head Start play? What role do community-based organizations play? What professional development strategies do we need? Reading first. People don't know what to do with English language learners, even when you segment out reading first in the early grades. More research and development is one small facet. The issues of facilities. Outreach is a huge issue. The federal government's got to step in. The reason kids in Chicago can't get a preschool slot is because there's no buildings. And I really challenge that an elementary school is going to take advantage of providing preschool slots when they don't have another slot for their 3rd grade kids. So this is the federal role, is to come in on facilities, to come in on professional development, to focus on English language learners. Do you agree?
Yes.
I mean, we should have a whole panel.
Okay, listen, thank you very much, folks. We've run long on time. I want to make 2 quick announcements. One is outside there is a 1-page summary of the new Head Start law, which I promised the sponsors of that legislation I'd make available today. The second is we are releasing a second report today on education budgets, and specifically the advanced appropriations process. There is an issue brief outside as well, which you did not have access to when you came in. Please be sure to take a look at that. Thank you for coming today, and I hope you continue to come to our events in the future.